Lack of compassion in humans is harder, says homeless man. They treat me like trash. Asterisk, Carlos Eduardo Santos had faced hunger, cold, and countless sleepless nights during his 5 years living on the streets of Chicago. But when asked about his greatest difficulty, his answer was immediate and devastating. It's not the hunger that hurts most. It's not the cold that wounds deepest. It's the way people look at me, or rather, how they refuse to look at all. It's being treated like I'm human garbage. Carlos, 51 years old, had been a respected math teacher until a combination of divorce, depression, and job loss led him to the streets. Now, sitting on a bench in the downtown area, he was sharing a painful truth that society prefers to ignore. For many homeless people, the absence of human compassion is more brutal than any physical deprivation. I can endure being hungry, Carlos said, his voice carrying a dignity that circumstances couldn't break. I can endure sleeping on the ground. I can endure the cutting cold of winter. But what I cannot endure is the way people treat me as if I were invisible, as if I weren't worthy of even recognition as a human being. Carlos's experience revealed a disturbing truth about human nature, that cruelty often comes not from malicious actions, but from the complete absence of action, from the refusal to acknowledge the humanity of someone who has lost everything. He was about to share stories that exposed the darkest side of human indifference. Yesterday, a woman passed by me and said to her child, "Don't look at him, honey. Those people are dangerous," Carlos recounted, his hands trembling slightly. I was just sitting here, reading a book I found in the trash. I wasn't asking for anything. I wasn't bothering anyone. But to her, I was automatically a threat, a problem, something to be avoided. What Carlos was about to reveal were the subtle and not so subtle ways society dehumanizes those who have lost their homes, transforming them into targets of contempt, fear, and worse yet, complete indifference. His story would show how lack of compassion can be more devastating than any material hardship. The dehumanization that Carlos faced daily began with small gestures that most people didn't even realize they were making. He described how people crossed the street to avoid him, how conversations stopped when he approached, how he was systematically excluded from public spaces he technically had the right to occupy. I became a ghost, Carlos explained, watching the constant movement of people around him. They can see me, but they act like I don't exist. When I try to greet someone, they look through me. When I need help, they pretend not to hear me. It's like I've been erased from the human community. Carlos spoke about the psychological torture of being treated as if he were contagious, as if poverty and homelessness were diseases that could be caught through simple human contact. He described how people would move away when he sat on public benches, how they would cover their noses when he passed by, how they would quicken their pace when they saw him approaching. I understand that I don't smell good, Carlos said, his voice heavy with shame. I understand that my appearance is disturbing, but I'm still a human being. I still have feelings, thoughts, dreams. When people treat me like I'm diseased, like I'm less than human, it kills something inside me every day. The most painful experiences came from people who had once known him in his previous life. Carlos described encounters with former colleagues, students, and neighbors who would pretend not to recognize him when they saw him on the streets. Last month, I ran into a former student, Carlos said, his eyes filling with tears. A young woman I had taught algebra to 5 years ago. She looked at me for a moment, and I saw recognition in her eyes. Then she looked away and walked quickly past me. I called her name, but she pretended not to hear me. I understood why. I was an embarrassment to her, a reminder that teachers can end up homeless. Carlos explained how this rejection from people who had once respected him was more devastating than any physical hardship. It reinforced his sense of social death, a feeling that he had not only lost his home, but his place in the human community. When people who once knew you pretend you don't exist, it makes you question whether you ever really existed at all, Carlos said. Maybe I was never really a teacher. Maybe I was never really a father. Maybe I was always just this homeless man that people avoid. The constant rejection had begun to affect Carlos's ability to interact with others. He described how he had started to avoid eye contact, how he had begun to expect rejection before it even happened, how he had internalized the message that he was unwanted and unworthy. I catch myself apologizing for existing, Carlos admitted. When I ask for help, I start by saying, I'm sorry to bother you. When I sit somewhere, I try to make myself as small as possible. I've started to believe that maybe they're right. Maybe I don't deserve to be treated with dignity. The business establishments that Carlos encountered daily had become laboratories of casual cruelty, where employees and customers alike seemed to compete in their ability to make him feel unwelcome. He described a systematic pattern of discrimination that went far beyond simple policy enforcement. There's a coffee shop I pass every morning, Carlos said, pointing down the street. The owner knows I'm not there to buy anything, but I've never bothered anyone. Still, every time I walk by, he comes out and tells me to keep moving. Not because I'm doing anything wrong, but because he doesn't want his customers to see me. Carlos spoke about the elaborate strategies businesses employed to exclude homeless people without explicitly saying so. Signs that read, "For customers," only on public benches, bathroom codes that change daily, and the sudden appearance of spikes or barriers in areas where homeless people might rest. They redesigned the city to make it hostile to us, Carlos explained. They don't want to solve homelessness. They just want to make us disappear. Every bench, every doorway, every public space is designed to prevent us from existing comfortably. The healthcare system presented its own forms of dehumanization. Carlos described being treated in emergency rooms, where staff made it clear they considered him a waste of resources, where his pain was dismissed as drug-seeking behavior, where his very presence was seen as an inconvenience. I had an infected cut on my leg, Carlos said, rolling up his pant leg to show a barely healed wound. When I went to the emergency room, the nurse looked at me with disgust and said, "What did you do to yourself now?" As if I had deliberately injured myself. As if I didn't deserve medical care because I'm homeless. The legal system added another layer of dehumanization. Carlos described being arrested for existing while homeless, charges like loitering, trespassing, and disturbing the peace that criminalized the basic activities of survival. Police treat us like criminals just for being poor, Carlos said. They move us along. They search us without cause. They speak to us like we're animals. I've been arrested for sleeping, for sitting, for asking for help. They act like being homeless is a crime that deserves punishment. Carlos had witnessed other homeless individuals being brutalized by both police and civilians, experiences that reinforced his understanding that society had designated people like him as acceptable targets for violence and abuse. I'd seen people kick homeless individuals who were sleeping, pour water on them, steal their belongings, Carlos said. And when police arrive, they rarely arrest the perpetrators. They just tell us to move along, as if we were the problem. We're not seen as victims, we're seen as nuisances. The media representation of homelessness added to the dehumanization. Carlos spoke about how news stories about homeless people focused on crime, addiction, and social problems, rarely presenting them as complex individuals with histories, dreams, and dignity. Every story about us is about what's wrong with us, Carlos said. We're statistics, problems, cautionary tales. We're never presented as people who had lives, careers, families. We're just props in other people's stories about urban decay and social failure. The psychological impact of sustained dehumanization had begun to fundamentally alter Carlos's sense of self and his relationship with the world. He described how months of being treated as subhuman had led him to internalize these messages, creating a form of psychological warfare that was more damaging than any physical assault. You start to believe what people tell you about yourself, Carlos said, his voice barely above a whisper. When hundreds of people treat you like you're worthless, you begin to think maybe you are worthless. When everyone acts like you're dangerous, you start to feel dangerous. When society tells you you don't belong, you stop believing you have a right to exist. Carlos spoke about the way dehumanization affected his ability to advocate for himself. He described how he had stopped fighting for better treatment, stopped asserting his rights, stopped expecting basic courtesy from others. I used to demand respect, Carlos said. I used to insist on being treated with dignity. But after years of being rejected, ignored, and abused, I gave up. It's easier to accept mistreatment than to fight for something you're never going to get. I stopped believing I deserved better. The isolation that came with dehumanization was perhaps the most devastating aspect. Carlos described how he had lost not only his home, but his entire social network, his sense of belonging, his connection to the human community. Humans are social beings, Carlos explained. We need connection, recognition, belonging. When society cuts you off from all of that, when you're treated like you're not part of the human family, it's like a form of social death. You're alive, but you're not really living. Carlos had watched other homeless individuals succumb to various forms of self-destruction, addiction, mental illness, suicide, and he understood these responses as rational reactions to irrational treatment. When people treat you like garbage long enough, you start to feel like garbage, Carlos said. Some people turn to drugs or alcohol to numb the pain. Others lose their minds. Others just give up entirely. It's not weakness. It's a normal response to abnormal cruelty. The constant vigilance required to navigate a hostile world had exhausted Carlos in ways that physical hardship never could. He described being in a constant state of alert, always ready for rejection, always preparing for the next humiliation. You can't relax when you're homeless, Carlos said. You're always on guard, always ready to be attacked or rejected. You're constantly reading people's faces, trying to figure out if they're going to hurt you or help you. It's exhausting to always be ready for cruelty. Carlos spoke about the way dehumanization had affected his ability to trust others, to form relationships, to believe in the goodness of humanity. Years of systematic rejection had made him suspicious of kindness and unable to accept help when it was offered. When someone is kind to me now, my first instinct is to wonder what they want from me, Carlos admitted. I've been tricked, manipulated, and humiliated by people who pretended to care. It's easier to expect the worst than to hope for the best and be disappointed. Despite the overwhelming cruelty he had experienced, Carlos had also encountered moments of unexpected compassion that reminded him of the potential for human goodness. These rare instances of kindness stood out like beacons of hope in an otherwise dark landscape of indifference. There's a nurse at the free clinic named Sarah, Carlos said, a small smile crossing his face. Every time I go there, she greets me by name. She asks about my day. She treats me like a person. She doesn't just see a homeless man, she sees Carlos. Those few minutes of recognition keep me going for weeks. Carlos described how these moments of human connection had become precious resources, more valuable than food or shelter. A simple acknowledgement of his humanity, a kind word, a moment of eye contact. These small gestures had enormous power to counteract the dehumanization he faced everywhere else. A child waved at me last week, Carlos said, his voice growing stronger. Just a little girl who saw me and waved. Her mother quickly pulled her away, but for that moment, I existed. I was a person worth greeting. It sounds silly, but it meant everything to me. Carlos had learned to recognize genuine kindness versus performative charity. He could distinguish between people who helped him because they saw him as human, and those who helped him to make themselves feel better about their own privilege. Real compassion is rare, Carlos explained. Most people who help do it to ease their own guilt or to feel good about themselves. They don't really see you. They see an opportunity to be charitable. But occasionally, you meet someone who looks at you and sees a fellow human being in need. Those people are angels. Carlos spoke about the homeless community and how they had developed their own networks of mutual support in response to society's rejection. Despite competing for limited resources, many homeless individuals showed each other the compassion that the broader society denied them. We take care of each other, Carlos said. We share information about safe places to sleep, where to find food, which people and places to avoid. We look out for each other when we're sick. We're building our own family from the people society has thrown away. The experience of dehumanization had also given Carlos a deeper appreciation for the small dignities of life that most people took for granted. He valued simple courtesies, basic respect, and acknowledgement of his humanity in ways that his previous life had never taught him. I notice kindness now in ways I never did before, Carlos said. When someone says please and thank you, when they make eye contact, when they speak to me like I'm intelligent, these things that most people don't even think about are incredibly meaningful to me now. Carlos had developed a philosophy about human nature based on his experiences. He believed that cruelty was often a result of fear and ignorance rather than inherent evil, and that many people were capable of compassion if they could overcome their prejudices. Most people aren't evil, Carlos said. They're scared. They're uncomfortable. They don't know how to relate to someone like me. If they could see past their fear and discomfort, many of them would be kind. The problem is that society teaches them to see us as problems rather than people. After 5 years on the streets, Carlos had reached a point where he could articulate not just his pain, but his hopes for how society might change its approach to homelessness. His experiences had given him insights into human nature that few people ever acquire, and his perspective on compassion had been forged in the crucible of systematic rejection. I don't want pity, Carlos said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived the unsurvivable. I want recognition. I want to be seen as a human being with a story, with value, with dignity. I want people to understand that. I'm not homeless because I'm lazy or worthless. I'm homeless because life broke me down and I haven't found a way to build myself back up. Carlos spoke about the transformative power of simple human recognition. He described how acknowledgement of his humanity had kept him from despair, how moments of compassion had given him the strength to continue fighting for survival. When someone treats me with respect, they're not just being nice, Carlos explained. They're saving my life. They're reminding me that I'm still part of the human family, that I still have worth, that I still deserve to exist. Compassion isn't charity. It's recognition of our shared humanity. Carlos had begun volunteering at a local homeless advocacy organization, using his experience to help others understand the psychological dimensions of homelessness. He spoke at community meetings, sharing his story and helping people understand the impact of their daily choices on homeless individuals. I tell people that they don't have to solve homelessness, Carlos said. They just have to remember that homeless people are people. A smile, a greeting, a moment of eye contact. These things cost nothing, but they mean everything. They can be the difference between someone maintaining their humanity or losing it entirely. The advocacy work had given Carlos a sense of purpose and had helped him reconnect with his identity as an educator. He was teaching again, but now his classroom was the streets, and his subject was human dignity. I'm still a teacher, Carlos said. I'm teaching people about compassion, about the importance of treating everyone with dignity. My students are the housed people who need to learn how to see homeless people as human beings. It's maybe the most important lesson I've ever taught. Carlos had also reconnected with some of his former students and colleagues. Relationships that had been restored when people learned to see past his circumstances to the person he remained. These renewed connections had reminded him of who he was before homelessness and who he could be again. "I'm not just a homeless man," Carlos said. "I'm a teacher, a father, a friend. I'm someone who loves mathematics, who enjoys reading, who has opinions about politics and dreams about the future. Homelessness is something that happened to me, not something I am." Carlos's ultimate message was one of hope tempered by realism. He understood that individual acts of compassion, while crucial, were not sufficient to solve the systemic problems that created homelessness. But he also believed that changing how society treated homeless people was an essential first step toward addressing the crisis. "We need policies and programs to address homelessness," Carlos concluded. "But we also need a revolution in how we see and treat each other. We need to remember that every person has dignity, that everyone deserves compassion, that no one is disposable. When we treat people like garbage, we diminish not just them, but ourselves." Carlos's story serves as a powerful reminder that behind every homeless person is a human being with a complex story, inherent dignity, and the fundamental right to be treated with respect and compassion. The next time you see a homeless person, Carlos said, remember that they're fighting battles you can't imagine. They're surviving not just poverty and exposure, but the daily assault on their humanity. The smallest act of recognition can be the difference between hope and despair. Please just see us. That's all we really want, to be seen as human beings worthy of basic dignity. If this story opened your eyes to the psychological dimensions of homelessness and reminded you of the power of simple human compassion, then please subscribe to our channel. We share stories like this every week, real accounts of resilience, dignity, and the fundamental importance of treating every person with respect. Hit that subscribe button and join a community that believes in the transformative power of recognition, empathy, and the simple act of seeing the humanity in everyone we meet.